I think it's very clear that there was an effort to manipulate the American people after 9/11 to exploit their patriotism to justify this major misadventure in the Middle East. I had a lot of concerns about the risk of a larger war with Iran, but what I give credit to the president for is that he ensured it was a limited operation. And he stepped off the escalation ladder, where you start to get in problems where that becomes a regular thing, a mow the grass type situation, where every 6 to 12 months we're doing something like that. And that is where you could really create large trade-offs against the Pacific. After 9/11, we needed to kill some people.
Yeah.
There needed to be an aggressive military, intelligence community, and law enforcement response. We had 3,000 Americans killed. In regards to Afghanistan specifically, we needed to do three things. We needed to punish the Taliban for sheltering Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We need to significantly degrade or destroy Al-Qaeda. And we need to kill Osama bin Laden.
Yeah. Everyone, welcome back to the Thinking Out Loud podcast. Today we have Dan Caldwell joining us. And Dan, for those of you who don't know, he's a former veteran. He served in the Iraq War, and more recently he's been working on the Pentagon. And more recently he worked under the Trump administration for a few months, where he served under Pete Hegseth and contributed a lot to the really early stages of the second Trump administration's foreign policy. So Dan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me on. As you
Pleasure,
said,
yeah.
My name is Dan Caldwell. My last big role was I was a senior advisor to the now Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. I was really focused on policy, mainly Russia, Ukraine, and some Middle East issues. Prior to that, I worked in the think tank and advocacy community for over a decade, focused mainly on foreign policy, defense policy, and veterans issues. I also worked for a member of Congress, and before that, I served in the United States Marine Corps. I served first at Camp David, which is the President's Retreat, and then I deployed to Iraq with 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you for your service, first of all. But so diving deeper a little into the foreign policy and kind of the legacy of foreign policy of the United States and what led to Trump coming in the first term. So Iraq, right? Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terror that we had after 9/11, that's largely seen as a mistake. And you pointed out a few times it's been a mistake. Tucker pointed out, and Trump's pointed out, made a big point out of it in his first campaign mostly, which back then was still kind of a stigma, right? The Republican Party was undecisive on taking a stance against it. And now it kind of seems like it's a status quo, right? Even more recently, you had Dick Cheney passing, and that was a big mark of that. So just wanted to get a feeling from your perspective. What do you think was the effect, the long-term effect now, 20 years down the line, of the United States interventionism in the Middle East? What legacy did we leave behind?
I think we left behind a legacy of death and destruction, and it's contributed to American decline. The decision after 9/11, which, let me be clear, after 9/11, we needed to kill some people.
Yeah.
There needed to be an aggressive military, intelligence community, and law enforcement response. We had 3,000 Americans killed. In regards to Afghanistan specifically, we needed to do three things. We needed to punish the Taliban for sheltering Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We need to significantly degrade or destroy Al-Qaeda. And we need to kill Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
The first 6 months of the war, we effectively overthrew and punished the Taliban movement. We degraded a lot of Al-Qaeda's key leadership and leadership infrastructure.
And that's all in Afghanistan.
Yes. Yeah. And then, we lost the trail on bin Laden, really because of dumb decisions made at the end of 2001 in Central Command, which was the military command overseeing the invasion. But bin Laden at that point was in Pakistan, and there was all the evidence was pointing that direction. So he was no longer in Afghanistan. He was in a country that at this point now we had established strong military relations with, were providing significant amount of aid to. And that at that point, why we needed to continue to pursue the project in Afghanistan, I think with the benefit of hindsight, was up for debate. But most certainly by 2011, we had accomplished those goals with the killing of bin Laden in Abbottabad. And so in regards to Afghanistan, the decision to turn that into a nation building project where let's call it what it is that, conservatives, Americans of a right-wing persuasion, we don't believe in social engineering. Okay? Mm-hmm. We don't believe in top-down social engineering. We were doing that abroad. We opposed social engineering at home, but we're okay with it abroad. That's what we were doing. We were trying to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, it is quite frankly not a vital national interest if girls and the young women in Afghanistan can go to school. I hope they can. I wish everybody can, but we should not be sending our sons and daughters to a foreign country to fight and die to try and impose our values on other people. Mm-hmm. And that's what we chose to do. And that is why the war became so disastrous. That is why it became so expensive. And ultimately, it's a big reason why, the war started in Afghanistan with the Taliban in control and it ended in Afghanistan with the Taliban in control. Yeah. And there hasn't been enough reflection on why that happened. It was our strategy. It's also, too, we also have to be honest that we made a decision to ally with some of the worst people in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. These were people that actually created the conditions for the rise of the Taliban.
Who were these people?
They were drug dealers. In a lot of cases, to be very blunt, they were pederasts. They were people that engaged in mass rape of young children. They extorted their communities. They were basically out of control warlords. Most of them were, leftovers from the Mujahideen that had fought the Soviets in the 80s.
That we gave weapons for.
Yeah. Yes. And I have to say that.
Back in the day,
that made sense. Yeah. But the Taliban emerged as a movement to reject these people. They got a lot of support from people around Kandahar because they were gonna kill the drug dealers. They were gonna kill the people that were kidnapping and raping their sons and daughters. Mm-hmm. And then they grew an effective military force, and then the Pakistanis switched support to them from other warlords, and they were able to take over large parts of the country. So when we came in after 9/11 and we overthrew, who did we bring back to run the country? The very same drug lords, pederasts, and other just awful people that had been rejected by the people of Afghanistan before to run the country. Yeah. So they did the same stuff they were doing in the 1990s, endemic corruption, drug dealing, and all these other things. And so one thing that was different from when the Taliban came in the 90s and this time around is they had a multi-ethnic coalition. Is that in the 90s, it was just the Pashtuns in the south. But the Afghan government was so awful that they enabled the Taliban to bring in other ethnic groups like the Uzbeks, the Tajiks in large numbers that previously didn't want anything to do with the Taliban. And so now, instead of controlling 80-90% of the country, the Taliban control 100% of the country. Yeah. So that's that is just how disastrous it was. I mean, over 2,000 lives lost, $2 trillion in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And then you get to Iraq. Uh-huh. Iraq was, again, I made a case for we had to do certain things in Afghanistan. We had an important but limited set of objectives to achieve there. Iraq was a war of choice. It was a war driven primarily by this ideology that we can impose democracy in the Middle East, and once we do it in one country, it's going to spread across the Middle East. It wasn't, as some leftists say, a war for oil. The reality is that a lot of other countries actually...
a war of ego, then.
It was a war of delusion. Okay. It was a war based on false premises about what American force of arms can achieve. And it was a war of that was pushed on the American people by lies. And I'm comfortable using that term. You have some people say, well, there are misunderstandings or, people thought this or this at the time. I think it's very clear that there was an effort to manipulate the American people after 9/11 to exploit their patriotism to justify this major misadventure in the Middle East. So again, what is the result of the Iraq War? Iraq is still a basket case of a country. It's a kleptocracy. It's controlled by effectively Iranian-backed groups.
Mm-hmm.
It is, maybe not formally an ally of Iran, but it is a country that has incredibly close links to Iran. It has major issues with poverty, with electrical generation, and it's not as bad as it was, say, 10 years ago with the rise of ISIS,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a country that still has severe systemic problems.
Yeah.
Next door, though, that country is now ruled by a guy, al-Shara,
Mm-hmm.
who was a leader of Al-Qaeda,
That's right.
the group that did 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
and was at one point fighting American troops in Iraq. And there's a direct connection between the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. Both, the Iraq War enabled
Mm-hmm.
the Syrian Civil War, specifically the rise of more of the jihadist groups.
Yeah.
And again, how does that war end? One of the leaders of the group that attacked us in 9/11 is in control. So you have Afghanistan run by the Taliban.
So all we did in 25 years now is basically go to the Middle East for multiple times in multiple different countries just to end up having one of these countries' government being led by the Al-Qaeda leader.
Yeah.
So we just come full circle, nothing
Yeah.
much is accomplished.
And let me be clear. I've said this publicly. I strongly support what President Trump is trying to do with al-Shara.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some people who think that we should kill him, and he's Al-Qaeda, he's bad. We should basically start doing aggressive counterterrorism against him and his supporters in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's in nobody's interest. We don't want to see the Syrian civil war start again.
Mm-hmm.
Because that creates a condition for the rise of ISIS again and other things. So I support what the Trump admin's doing, but there's kind of the point of it is, if we could negotiate and work with some of these people, a lot of them had to die, but some of them obviously you can negotiate with.
Yeah.
Maybe that should have been more of the approach,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe we should have better understood why, like, a guy like al-Shara was joining Al-Qaeda,
Mm-hmm.
and why, like, what led to him becoming radicalized and ultimately joining the fight first against American troops in Iraq. And it's because we invaded an Arab country
Mm-hmm.
where, again, there wasn't a direct threat to us at that time, was not part of 9/11. And that incited a lot of people of particularly in the Arab world, but globally, to want to come there and fight the Americans.
Yeah.
And it led to the rise of more jihadist groups.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Obviously, everything goes back to 9/11. And basically the narrative that the intelligence agents put out is that we didn't know it was coming. We didn't have enough information to predict that the planes were going to be taken over and they were going to hit the towers. Like, they had no idea what was coming. And obviously, there's some solid evidence to know that the FBI had a lot of pieces of information and the CIA had a bunch of information that they just didn't share with each other for 1,000 different reasons, that they could piece things together if they just worked better, more cohesively. And as a result of that, after 9/11, we just drastically expanded the U.S. security apparatus, right? With mainly the Patriot Act, but just everything that was unleashed by Snowden and all this mass surveillance of the U.S. population. So you talked a little bit about the legacy of these wars abroad. How do you see the legacy of these wars for the American people?
Well, a few days ago, there was an election in Virginia, where I live. Why is Virginia a more reliably blue state than it was 20 years ago or 25 years ago? Well, it's been the massive expansion of the contractor state and the security state. And a lot of those people vote for Democrats. Why? Because Democrats usually support things like government pay raises, more government spending. And there's kind of this myth that the American national security state is inherently conservative. And maybe at different points in American history, there was some truth to that, but that's actually hasn't been true in a long time. So there's electoral consequences. It's made one important state more reliably blue. But that's the least important one. Let me be clear. we have this massive surveillance in federal law enforcement state, and it is now increasingly not weaponized against, jihadists or, foreign radicals, but against our own people. Whether it's going after traditional Catholics over their opposition to abortion. I don't know if you've been following what's been going on with Arctic frost in Washington, D.C. There was this FBI operation exposed, and I may get some of the details wrong, but essentially they were investigating and having informants pass along information on leaders of major conservative institutions, including friends of mine, great American patriots at the Conservative Partnership Institute, America First Legal, my former employers, the Center for Renewing America. The authorities and the systems that were used to execute Arctic frost and go after these conservative institutions were born after 9/11. And, today, the Patriot Act is more often used, not in terrorism cases, but in drug cases, organized crime cases, RICO cases, stuff far afield from the threat of Al-Qaeda. And as you mentioned, it's important to remember that the FBI and CIA basically had almost a complete picture of what was going to happen. They just, because of egos in those institutions and other parts of the government, they weren't sharing it, they weren't coordinating, they were more worried about infighting and their place in some bureaucratic infrastructure. And as a result, 3,000 Americans died. Now, I want to be clear, counterfactuals and things are sometimes difficult, but I think there's no guarantee. Let me back up. There's no guarantee that they could have stopped the attack in full.
Yeah, of course.
But I do think it is safe to say is that they could have broken up at least part of the plot and maybe saved, several hundred, 1,000 lives in 9/11. But and I think it's fair to say they probably could have stopped the whole plot. So my point of walking through that, as you alluded to, is it kind of calls into question, did we need all these new laws and authorities and systems after 9/11, considering really what the core problem was a lack of information sharing and this bureaucratic competition driven by people that cared more about their own positions as opposed to protecting the American people.
Yeah. So I want to dive into a little more, specifics of current foreign policy. Obviously we mentioned Trump's foreign policy stance is was very much against what happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan in the very non-interventionist lane, very, dovish foreign policy, if you will. So what's going on with Iran, right? Because, we had the so-called 12-day war with, Israel and Iran in this June. And the president, of course, used the B-2 bombers to bomb the nuclear facility testing site in Iran. And a lot of people saw that as a breaking promise, right? Why are we bombing Iran on behalf of another country? Should we keep doing that? Are we basically is Trump going back on his campaign, on his foreign policy stances that he made on his campaign? How do you see this entanglement with Iran currently?
I think this is a good question. It's public record. I had serious concerns about attacking Iran. I'm not going to hide from that. I'm not going to diminish that. I have concerns about getting sucked into a major war with Iran and the potential cost of that. But look, as some people told me and pointed out to me, people that I respect and I work with in the administration, President Trump was always clear he didn't want Iran to have a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's a
But I guess the better question is how do we find the balance between not allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and not going back to having a whole entanglement in the Middle East?
So I think that is the needle that they're trying to thread. And,
it's very hard.
President Trump made clear that he had this very limited objective in what he did, and that was very focused on the Iranian nuclear program. Other people wanted him to pursue a regime change operation, and so far he has not done that. And he has consistently talked about still wanting to pursue a deal with Iran. And I believe that is the best approach. Militarily, it is, even with that, operation being well executed and likely causing significant damage to the Iranian nuclear program, the best way to ultimately restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions in a significant way for a long period of time is through a robust diplomatic agreement that is, backed up by the threat of American force and punishing economic sanctions. But that is the best way. The other way, which would be incredibly costly and something that I think very few Americans actually want, would be a massive invasion and regime change in Iran. And that could be incredibly deadly, destabilizing to the region, and not something that would be in America's interest or in the region's interest. And that includes everybody from Israel to Saudi Arabia or to Iraq. I don't want to speak for any of those countries, but I don't think ultimately it would benefit anyone in the region.
Yeah. Something interesting we talked about over the last few weeks that you've been here in Chicago is the amount of resources we've been sending out of the country, depleting our stockpiles of our arsenals of missiles, of tanks or whatnot to send to Israel, to send to Ukraine, and in this case to deter Iran. How do you see the U.S. sending ammunition, sending equipment to other countries and let them fight the war for us? Because of course that's it's pretty expensive still, but you're not risking American lives directly. And you're still having some deterrence in the forms of Ukrainians fighting for us and Israelis fighting for us. How do you see that?
Well, again, another interesting question. So, I do think the United States has certain interests in the major regions of the country. I think a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment overstate those interests as a way to justify, significant American military engagement in places like the Middle East and Europe, particularly. I believe that the United States can effectively secure our interests more effectively in certain regions by working through partners, ensuring that they're equipped to secure their own regions and ensure that there's not the rise of a regional hegemon in those regions. The challenge we have right now, though, is our capacity to do that. And unfortunately, because of decades of deindustrialization, really bad defense procurement policy, and just bad mindsets around the types of weapons we need to develop and buy, we don't have the ideal capacity to do that. Now, fortunately, you have a really good team at the Department of War, from Secretary Hegseth to Deputy Secretary Feinberg. Good friend of mine, the Undersecretary Acquisition and Sustainment, Mike Duffy, really good service secretaries like Dan Driscoll, John Phelan, Troy Mink, and a whole bunch of other people. This is a huge issue for them, and they're trying to fix it. So, I would hope in the coming years we have more capacity to do that. And so instead of having so much of our troops bogged down in, say, the Middle East, is that we can create a coalition, something building off the Abraham Accords, like in the Middle East, where you have a balancing coalition, where you keep an external hegemon out, ensure that there isn't the rise of one in the Middle East, and then we're primarily engaging in more of an offshore way. There's people that use the term offshore balancing to describe that approach. But the issue is capacity, and it's limited. And so, particularly with Ukraine, our support for them has really worn down our readiness and ability to fight a intense, sustained war for more than a few days. And again, the Trump administration is taking actions to change that. They've changed how weapons are supplied to Ukraine in a way that I think prioritizes our own readiness and our own stockpiles in a better way.
But still, we're depleting the stockpiles.
Yeah, we still have deliveries going out to Ukraine,
but not new deliveries.
But not, there hasn't been the new arms deliveries to Ukraine have been done through basically redirecting arms deliveries to European countries they're going to European countries, and the European countries are then choosing to send that
Okay.
to Ukraine.
Okay.
So they aren't coming out of our stockpiles going forward. There's still some longer term contracts that are being delivered, but it has been tapering off the last few months.
Okay.
On the kind of question of Israel and our support for them is, Israel has a very capable defense industry, and they have developed an effective, air defense system. We had to plug gaps in that during the 12-day war against Iran, and we did expend a lot of ammunition to do that. But I think with a country like Israel is there's kind of increasing recognition that it's in both countries' interests to build up their own capacity to fill the gaps as opposed to the United States coming in. And that's of mutual benefit to both sides. And so I think that's going to be the approach you're going to see going forward. And I think that this administration and hopefully future ones want to. But, just to kind of close on this important issue is that there are a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment, and sometimes they don't say it out loud, is that they don't actually support increasing allied capacity because they want
to keep these countries reliant on the U.S.
Right. Yeah. And it's even worse than that.
Okay.
Is that a lot of those countries have constituencies in their own countries that want them to be reliant on the U.S. This is how pathetic a lot of the Europeans are when it comes to defense matters. Is that they want to basically have Uncle Sam be their daddy and to basically continue to be, the primary security guarantor for their continent, because they don't want to step up and spend more. They don't want to step up and invest more in their own defense. So, they'd rather spend that money on their welfare states or on, funding mass immigration into their continent. So they're totally fine giving up a large part of their independence and degrading their own military capability if, as long as Uncle Sam continues to be Uncle Sucker on the continent.
Yeah, but here comes the other question, because, I think there's a common misperception that the U.S. today is basically the U.S. that we had in the 1940s, where you can just basically McDonald's a crazy amount of tanks and a crazy amount of missiles, crazy amount of ammunition. And if push comes to shove, say, whatever reason, to go to war with China, a very important war, very, massive scale war. I think there's this misconception that we can just completely overhaul all our manufacturing capacities and compete with the Chinese with our current manufacturing plant structure. First of all, is that a misconception? Can we still produce, in a pace sustainable with the Chinese? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear yours. And if so, what's the way we can, keep supporting our allies to this extent we were talking about, but also ensure that we build this industrial plant, this industrial manufacturing capacity to, if push comes to shove, we can crank that out way faster than we are.
I mean, the Chinese are outpacing us exponentially. I believe they have something like 230 times the shipbuilding capacity that we do.
There's one shipyard in China that produces more ships than all the shipyards in the U.S. combined, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
We have struggled to increase our production of precision munitions. Key munitions that would be critical in a fight. In a lot of cases, we're only producing less than 1,000 a year, and that's public knowledge. There's some classified stuff I can't get into, but you see people touting, it's well, we went from producing 350 Patriot missiles a year to 600, and it's well, that's great. The Russians produce 1,200 Iskander ballistic missiles a year,
still double ours.
Yeah. So what are we? That's kind of something that people haven't fully grasped. And even during World War II, I mean, we had limits. We had capacity limits, and there's been a lot of new scholarship on this. I know it's controversial in some cases, but one reason why we couldn't be as aggressive in the Pacific, even though Japan attacked us, was because we prioritized two things: the European theater and also supporting Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Lend-Lease. Oftentimes, Lend-Lease aid to Soviet Union was prioritized over supporting American forces. But
Yeah.
one big difference between World War II and now, it comes down to the complexity of the munitions and the weapon systems
Of
we're
course.
building.
Yeah.
They have long, I always get the term like what do you call tails, production tails. I'm by no means an expert on this, but long supply chains and whatnot. And the number of individual components in a Patriot missile is exponentially more than what you needed for a World War II artillery shell or a M1 Garand or 1911 pistol.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big part of the problem. So we need to get to a place, and there are people working on this. I'm not sure if we can move fast enough at sometimes that they're trying to solve that problem where we're trying to do more things that are simple and at scale.
Yeah.
So companies like Anduril are working on this. Others are. I think that's something that we need to be really thinking about. And the Russians have done this with their Shahed drones and a lot of their cheaper UAV systems and stuff. They have produced a lot of really simple technology at scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one reason why, particularly the last couple of years, they've become more effective in hitting Ukraine and, degrading their military capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something also really interesting is that, back in the 90s, right before the Cold War ended, we had 50-ish big defense contractors. And famously, right after the Cold War ended, there was the Last Supper, they call
Yes.
it, where the Pentagon assembled all these CEOs of these big contractor companies and said, look, we're going to trim the budget significantly because, of course, the Cold War ended and we don't need as much money going to the military. So please, all of you merge.
Yeah.
So basically, you had these 50 companies now become what's the big five, right? Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and RTX. Yeah, that's right. So what happened was that you had 50 big companies with a budget, and now you have five, but now after 9/11 and after the war in the Middle East, our budget now is bigger than it's ever been before, and we have less competition. So something you were talking about is that the contracting capabilities are our contracting system is not perfect, right? You talked about Anduril being a good outlier there and creating new innovative solutions. But how do you see the current contracting environment, the current production environment of these equipments? How does that affect our ability to, one, use our funds smartly, right? Use American taxpayer money smartly, and also in terms of military deployment and production.
So again, I'm by no means an expert on this.
Yeah.
What I would say is that there's a dynamic in Washington where a lot of people like to beat their chest and go to big conferences and talk big about reform. But when the rubber actually meets the road, a lot of people chicken out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of attempts at acquisition reform, some good, some not good, some of it really bad. And that has it has almost never played out the way that I think a lot of people hoped it would.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's easy to say you support acquisition reform, but then you realize that a bill that actually could change things as a member of Congress could lead to job losses in your district or in your state as a senator.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you have to think through geez, do I want to lose a job, 100 jobs, 1,000 jobs in this place, or do I want to support reforms that could actually improve our nation's ability to defend itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that a lot in these debates, and it's one reason why the big primes.
Mm-hmm.
And look, you have to say something. There is something worth acknowledging is that the primes have one thing that some of the startups don't have, and that's capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have enough capacity, to be honest. But they can adjust things, and they have more workforce. They have more mass,
Mm-hmm.
and so they can do things, and that a lot of the startups can't because they just haven't built out the infrastructure and capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So these aren't easy solutions, these aren't easy problems, and there's not easy solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But I am confident, very confident in saying that the biggest thing we need to focus on is actually being able to once again build certain weapons and certain weapon systems at scale in a more rapid manner. And we've lost our ability to do that in a lot of key areas.
Hmm. Interesting. And something we touched a little bit on Ukraine. I know you're more focused on the Middle East, and that's why I want to get back to it real soon. But uh, so Ukraine, there's been this massive shift towards NATO now is requiring its members to spend 5% of their GDP in the military. Of course, it was 2% before, and even then they didn't comply, right? But now there's a 5% threshold that they gotta comply. Um, how do you think the war in Ukraine is heading out now that we're, phasing out our commitments to Ukraine? And do you see the Europeans picking up the space, given that they don't have a lot of capacity? How do you see that scenario shaping out?
So I have actually worked a lot on Ukraine. I was part of the Russia-Ukraine team in the Trump administration when I was there. I
Mm-hmm.
visited Ukraine. I've written a lot about it. Um, so, a couple thoughts is that the Europeans are stepping up right now and actually following through with spending commitments in a big way
Mm-hmm.
because they're afraid of Donald Trump. They're afraid that he is willing to do something, like possibly just withdrawing from NATO
Mm-hmm.
because there's too many free riders. It's not America's interest anymore. I'm not an advocate of that.
Yeah.
Complete pullout. I'm skeptical of NATO expansion. I oppose NATO expansion. I think we need to take a different role in the alliance. But President Trump's put a lot on the table.
Mm-hmm.
They're worried about more massive retrenchment, and a lot of research has shown that countries will not step up and spend more unless they perceive an actual security challenge with a major country that maybe was providing security guarantees before or security umbrella before stepping back.
Mm-hmm.
And so my friend Justin Logan at the Cato Institute wrote a great piece on this called Uncle Sucker a few years ago that dives into this, and I encourage people to read that. So again, I think Trump has and Secretary Hegseth and others have really done a good job of scaring the bejesus out of the Europeans and
Mm-hmm.
getting them to do more. But what I would say to them is they need to make sure that they're not getting caught in the same trap the Biden administration is. And the Biden administration, they got all these commitments to spend more, and many of them, those commitments were broken. And why did that happen? Because the United States doubled down in Europe. We sent more
Mm-hmm.
troops to Europe. Biden started talking about the importance of the transatlantic alliance and NATO and turning NATO into like this foreign policy holy sacrament.
Yeah.
This thing that you can't question or unless you're a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to, the rhetoric needs to be followed through like, okay, now the Europeans are spending more, they're building more capacity. So that's an opportunity for us to step back.
Mm-hmm.
And that will ensure that they are actually spending money, first of all, and then spending it on things that enhance their capacity. Now, in regards to the war in Ukraine, I have to be honest with you is that I just find a lot of the Europeans on this, not all. I think there are certain countries that are more realistic about this, but incredibly frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they build this up in this massive challenge that this is a sign like Russia's ready to march on Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris, and
Uh-huh.
that this is why we need to strengthen and expand NATO, and the United States needs to stay on the continent. But they themselves often don't act like it is a security challenge that they say it is.
That's right.
So it's stated
Yeah.
preference versus revealed preference.
Yeah, it's like Putin's so miserable, Putin's so weak, but at the same time, oh my God, this is such a big threat.
Yeah, and as we sit here, behind you, there's a picture of Angela Merkel, and
That's
she
right,
was a
yeah.
master at basically buying Russian gas, deindustrializing Germany, keeping their military weak. But she'd constantly hype up the need for NATO, and she'd use the threat of Russia at times to do that. She was talking out both sides of her mouth. She's awful. There's things that the former Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi said about her that I won't say on the show. One of my favorite Donald Trump.
We're not PG-13 here. You can go for it
Well,
if
this
you
is
want, but this
rated
is
R.
all of you. Yeah.
This is rated R. But my favorite Angela Merkel story is that President Trump just despised her, and at a I think it was a NATO summit. I know we're getting off track here, but this is a hilarious story.
Yeah.
Like, he had like a bowl of Starbursts, and he just starts throwing them at Angela Merkel and says, "Don't ever say I don't give you anything." And so, like, I mean, that's just perfect.
That's funny.
But that rant aside, is that, look, I mean, Europe does have the capacity to do a lot more to support Ukraine. There are certain things that I'll admit, like on air defense, that no, they don't have the capacity, but they could be doing a lot more in terms of munitions. And they have stepped up more this year, again, out of fear of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But there's more they can do around artillery, munitions, and things like that. And then securing NATO's eastern flank, and hopefully they'll start doing that. But the worst thing the Europeans are doing, in my view, is they're undermining diplomacy. Okay? They know this war is not going to end with a complete Ukrainian victory.
Mm-hmm.
They've known that since 2022. But they have not been productive partners in diplomacy, with the exception of a couple of countries like Turkey, which is a member of NATO. They're not European, but they are a member of NATO. Hungary, a few other states have been helpful in that.
Yeah.
But they have been urging and trying to undermine efforts by President Trump to engage in diplomacy, which is difficult. It's a long process. There's going to be fits and starts. There's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And they could be more productive in that. And I don't think they have. So that's why I have a lot of frustration with the Europeans on defense policy and on diplomatic efforts.
Okay. Yeah, another really interesting thing that I try to explore myself is that how does soft power come into play, right? Because the big argument for the Democrats and for everyone saying that Trump's foreign policy is complete bullshit is that we're letting these countries, specifically the European countries, out of our soft power sphere, right? We're letting them grow by themselves, and they're not relying on the U.S., and that's a bad thing. But something I wanted to ask you is the minerals deal in Ukraine, right? Because that's the rare earth minerals deal in Ukraine is going to allow U.S. companies to go in Ukraine, and it's going to give the U.S. basically a financial reward to having helped Ukraine for all these years. And I was wondering, how do you see these types of deals, such as the Ukraine mineral deal, or more even closer to you as the Panama deal that the U.S. helped broker with BlackRock to purchase the Panama Canal ports? How do you see these private transactions with American companies help carry out American foreign policy abroad without using taxpayer money? Mouthful of a question, but...
Well, I would just say that President Trump's approach to engaging with the world has been primarily through the lens of economic partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we engage in economic deals that benefit the American people? It's not, the primary approach isn't, military or trying to bully or lecture countries on why you should adopt certain values. It's been, okay, these countries are looking to invest elsewhere. They have, economic resources that they want to trade with the United States. And I think that is an effective use of America's economic soft power to achieve American interests.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a way to engage the world that is superior to military first,
mm-hmm.
or what you saw a lot. I mean, you saw it in most administrations after the Cold War, but like these aggressive, State Department driven quasi regime change things like color revolutions. Like that's not that is, I guess you could say, technically soft power, but that's not
mm-hmm.
that's not in our interest.
A little too much.
Yeah. So I think that's a superior way to deal with it. Now, I want to talk about Ukraine in Europe, and I think you were talking about European strategic autonomy, European being
mm-hmm.
more, autonomous. I'm somebody who didn't think that was necessarily a bad thing because, it would enable, United States to do certain things in areas that are more important to it, like the Pacific and in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
But the Europeans have basically said that they don't, they want to subordinate a lot of their interests to the United States.
Yeah.
My hope is that doesn't lead to the United States continuing to subsidize their defense in perpetuity at the level it currently is. But I don't think they have any desire to try and achieve that. At least now. That may change over the next few years, but they've instead chosen to pursue these economic deals where they clearly got the short end of the stick compared to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have this concern that, as some people in Washington, D.C. say, it's like, oh, well, if, we pull a couple combat brigades out of Europe or cut our forces there, the Europeans are automatically going to align with Beijing and, start, aligning with Russia or whatever the nonsense you hear coming out of some of these think tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is kind of something that's a lot of hyperbole that is designed to kind of scare people and scare the administration from pursuing certain policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to touch a little bit on China before we wrap up here. So I personally think China is the biggest threat to the U.S. as of now. I don't think Russia stands close to the level of harm China can do to the U.S. And as you mentioned before, China can just outproduce us in any way, right? In ships and planes and missiles, they can just completely outproduce whatever we can produce. So I think that's an incredible threat to the U.S. And I was thinking, how do we tackle the problem of China, right? How do we, mainly in two questions, how do we go to the Pacific in a way that we learned from our mistakes in Europe? What I mean by that is we expanded NATO very fast, very quickly after the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that, of course, pissed off Russia, and that didn't go so well. How do we do the same thing in Asia? Keep expanding our alliances in Asia with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, and with specifically with India, which is a very is a joker card in that region, right? It's always flip-flopping between us and China and Russia. How do we expand that? And second thing is, what should we focus on domestically to be able to take on China if push comes to shove?
Well, I think I'll take the domestic front first.
Okay.
Is one, I think that we need to continue to pursue policies that are going to enable economic growth, that create a economic system here at home that enables the growth of skilled labor, skilled workforce. Look, I have a lot of friends that disagree on how top down the United States should be on this. Like, how much of an industrial policy should we pursue?
I mean, I can tell you, people at economics in Chicago say no.
Yes. Well, look, this is a home of Milton Friedman.
Exactly.
I have friends on both sides of this debate.
Yeah.
But what I would say is we need to create, and maybe this is a cop out or a punt. I'm more of a foreign policy guy.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to have economic strength. We need to create the conditions for a healthy, functioning economy, because I think this area where there is more agreement, one of our bigger problems, our most honestly long-term problem that threatens our economic viability, is our national debt.
Of course.
And we need to get our finances back in order, because that's a point of leverage that Chinese have. And it also makes it more difficult to have to rapidly spend more in the case of a war.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things we need to do on the home front. Now, looking in the region, I think that
how do you say we do those things at the home front? Because tariffs seem to be a way. We're just onshoring a bunch of industries that if we come to being closer to being at war, we can have GM stop producing cars and start producing tanks, or do these things that once we have the industrial powerhouse, we can change that. How do we establish that? Just, of course, you're not an economic policy expert, but just how do you see that happening?
Look, that is the policy the administration is pursuing of tariffs. They hope that's what it achieves.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if, it ultimately works out. There's some evidence that maybe it is starting to work. That's one option. I think the regulatory environment is one of the biggest inhibitors of industrial growth in the United States. Power generation in particular, it is still incredibly difficult to build power plants. We're devoting a lot of energy and resources to these AI data centers, and that's consuming a lot of our electricity generation.
Yeah.
That makes it more expensive to reindustrialize or to build manufacturing base. And of course, you have the workforce issue. We just don't have enough skilled people to fill some of these jobs. And that's easy for us to say here at U Chicago.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is a reality. Is that's one of the biggest inhibitors, for example, at shipyards, is they just don't have enough people. So that's a bigger problem that we need to fix. That's going to require a whole of government. When I say whole of government, a approach at local, state, national. Well, I personally don't think we should have Department of Education, but this is a problem that may require a more national solution. And again, I don't have the answers to all of this, but it is, for me, I think the starting point is, we have done a lot of things that have made it hard for the United States to actually produce the things that we need to produce here. And I would start there with the regulatory framework. So beyond that, getting out of the United States and looking kind of in Asia, look, I think the Trump administration is taking the right approach here. Some could call it a Goldilocks approach, a bifurcated approach, whatever term you want to use, but they're really focused on two things. One, developing a fairer bargain with the Chinese when it comes to economic engagement. Doing things that decrease tensions around Taiwan so we don't preordain a war, while at the same time taking measures to rebuild American hard power in the region and build better cooperative partnerships with certain countries. Now, you brought up what happened with NATO and Europe. What we don't want to have happen is where we discourage countries that are wealthier, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, other potential partners in the region, from doing more for their own defense.
Yeah.
Because that's a risk. If we do more and send the wrong signals in the region, they will be incentivized to do less. At the same time, though, we don't want, and this is I think where like the Taiwan question for me comes into play, is that this is one reason I don't support strategic ending strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, where we would strategic ambiguity is where we keep it vague whether or not we will actually come to Taiwan's defense.
You think we should say yes or say no? Definitely.
I don't think we should say anything at all. I think we need to maintain strategic ambiguity. It's worked for over 50 years now. And I worry if we say yes, the Taiwanese are going to, spend less than they already are in defense. And Taiwan is really not stepped up the way they should. I mean, in no world should Poland be spending 5% of GDP on defense. And yeah, they have the Russian threat. Yeah. But Taiwan, spending 2.5% of GDP, that's just unacceptable.
Taiwan is like right in the front line there,
Yeah, and
they're the target, right? They're the main target.
And their plan that's been leaked is essentially hold out just long enough for the United States to come and rescue us. And it's like, that's not acceptable. You need to do more for your own defense. So we need to make sure that we're pursuing policies that encourage them to do that. We need to prioritize as well too, arms deliveries, and if there's an Asian partner that places an arm delivery, places an arms order, that needs to be prioritized, because that is
over Europe,
over most other regions. Unless it's going to our own, and there's different kind of pipelines of weapons and how that works, but unless it's going to our own, military, I think that Asia needs to be prioritized in that regard. Likewise, we need to have, I'm an advocate of greatly retrenching, not completely withdrawing, but in the Middle East and Europe. We do need to increase certain military assets in the Pacific, mainly naval and air force, I think. So those are things we need to do. But the key thing though is that we need to do now. I've already used the term is prioritize, prioritize, prioritize. To properly prioritize something needs to mean be doing less elsewhere.
That's
the
right.
The two places where we need to be doing that are the Middle East and Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so resources need to be flowing to that potential contingency as opposed to Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah. And when you say deprioritize, of course, you mean less entanglement in Europe and the Middle East. But would it a momentaneous a very specific strike, for example, the strike that we did in Iran, would that still go against the strategy of prioritizing? Because that was one specific attack, one specific day that completely, pushed back. Like, how do you see this very specific types of attack compared to a 2 year long engagement in Ukraine? Do you think those types of attacks are fine, or are both things wrong? Another example of the Venezuelan boat strike, of course. How do you see those momentaneous things?
Well, the Venezuelan boat strikes is actually, whatever you think of whether that's a good or bad idea, is we aren't using a lot of resources on that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean those.
But something like Operation Midnight Hammer, I think what I give, and again, I had a lot of concerns about the risk of a large war with Iran, but what I give credit to the president for is that he ensured it was a limited operation, and he stepped off the escalation ladder. He made very clear, this is what we're doing, we're done, signal out to the Iranians, made a decision to absorb a symbolic counterattack and not go anywhere from there. Now, what I will say is where you start to get in problems, where that becomes a regular thing, a mow the grass type situation, where every 6 to 12 months we're doing something like that. And that is where you could really create large trade-offs against the Pacific. And we did do something like that this year. Yeah. I think the war in Yemen, Operation Rough Rider. Yeah. Again, credit to President Trump for ending it.
De-escalating it. Yeah.
Yeah. But, there were people, I can tell you, in the Pentagon and elsewhere who wanted that to be a 6 to 8 month campaign.
Jesus.
That would have
wow. Okay.
That would have traded off significantly, severely
degraded
our readiness in the Pacific.
Yeah.
And, I would note, what did President Trump do at the end of the day? Is he cut, and Steve Witkoff played a key role in that. I think Steve Witkoff, by the way, is one of the best men, a true peacemaker in the administration. And Jared Kushner deserves a lot of credit for what he helped drive the Middle East too. Where you run into problems, whether it's military options in the Middle East or elsewhere, is when they go on for a prolonged period of time. That is when you get the real degradation of our readiness and capabilities in the Pacific. So if, for example, Operation Midnight Hammer turns into something that we're doing every 6 to 12 months, there's a lot of risks with that. You could have a larger regional war. But also, too, is you're using a lot of munitions and wearing down equipment that would be critical in a fight against China. Yeah. Again, you could get in a similar situation in Venezuela. So that's the thing that I think needs to be managed in situations like that. And look, again, I still believe in a high bar for using military force. Yeah. And even if it's just limited military force, that still needs to be a last resort and highly debated and highly considered within any administration.
Yeah. Well, good thing these past military actions have descaled pretty quickly, as you mentioned. We didn't go into a 6-month war in Yemen or in Iran, which is pretty nice to have for once. Yeah. But just my final question for you here before we wrap things up. This has been an incredibly transformative year for American foreign policy. Huge shift in how we treat NATO and Ukraine, and how we perceive Israel, how we perceive the Middle East, and of course, as you mentioned, Asia. First of all, do you think this approach, this less interventionist approach, is here to stay? Say Trump doesn't win in 2028. Do you think we're gonna not Trump, but like, say another Republican doesn't win in 2028. does this go off the tracks and we go back to very hawkish foreign policy again and very interventionist? And just how do you see the U.S. foreign policy going in the next 5 years?
Um, this is a very good question. So I hope we continue to see our foreign policy changing.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is that there's people who are maybe delusional to believe that we can go back to doing what we were doing in 1995 or 2005. The reality is, as we've discussed throughout this conversation, is there's real limits on American power that constrain our ability to do certain things. My big fear is that we will be forced to change American foreign policy by a national security or economic disaster because we all have people that are in denial about the limits of our power. Instead of retrenching responsibly, driving a new foreign policy on our terms and our timetable. That is my big concern, is that we will be forced to do it instead of doing it, in a way that is best for the American people and best for American economic and military strength.
Mm-hmm. And this shift to Asia and really, as you said, taking way more attention to China, prioritizing China. Do you think that's a secular trend? Do you think it's a structural change that the United States is doing and is going to keep doing?
Well, this is actually a very interesting question, because I have a lot of friends that actually think that in the long term we're going to cut a deal with China where, again, I'm not endorsing or opposing this, but that we'll cut a grander bargain with China where we allow more Chinese influence in the region. We kind of make the decision that we aren't going to pursue. I don't think we should pursue a Cold War, but we aren't going to pursue a Cold War.
Yeah.
And that we actually aren't going to do a lot of the things that many of the China hawks have been demanding we do. And that it's not inevitable because, for a variety of reasons, our own challenges at home, certain interest groups in the United States want to keep us in Europe or the Middle East, that we'll kind of just not want to tackle the China problem in a way that some think we are. And that pursuing some type of grand bargain and making concessions in exchange for other certain things is the way that we'll pursue it. But I do think within the Republican Party, there is still a belief that this is a real challenge and we need to be preparing for that in hopes that it doesn't lead to a war, that we're deterring a war, not taking actions that lead to a war that nobody should really want. Mm-hmm. So, again, just to sum it up is that I hope that the foreign policy establishment starts to move more towards I am at on foreign policy. Mm-hmm. That you have more people who are in line with President Trump, Vice President Vance, and others, and that we don't have a reversion to the George W. Bush foreign policy, because I don't think that would be good for the United States.
Yeah. Well, perfect. Thank you very much. That was a lot of good conversation, and I'm sure our listeners got a lot of things to talk about from it. So, Dan, thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure. And for you, the viewer, I'm going to be back in a few weeks with another episode. Thank you very much.
Yeah.